I'm Simmons Chase, the publisher and editor of synthetic.com, and I'm pleased to welcome Matt McKnight, Chief Commercial Officer of GINKGO BIOWORKS. Listeners are advised that this interview is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment advice. Matt, simple engineering of plants and animals has been going on for centuries. Many vegetables we eat today are human-crafted variants of common ancestor species, and animals evolved through selective breeding. I know you studied history before business, so I'm curious how you think about SynBio in terms of history and the link to the design, build, test methods employed today.
Well, first of all, Simmons, thank you for having me on today. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this any chance we get. Yeah, I think maybe first, an interesting way to answer that question is I studied history before I studied business, and now I work at GINKGO BIOWORKS, which is obviously one of the preeminent synthetic biology platform companies in the world. And that in itself kind of speaks to the maturation of a set of technologies that allow us to do different things with biology, where people that are not PhDs, right? So historically in biotech, you'd even have to be a PhD to be a business person in the industry. And every industry you can look at that is a technically focused or hard technology industry has had that evolution. You look at computing early on, you had to be a deep, hard technology scientist to participate in computing. So that's one interesting anecdote about the evolution. I feel incredibly fortunate myself. At GINKGO, I'm surrounded by incredible scientists, and what's one of the superpowers of building a platform company is that you have this like very wide variety of technical and non-technical talent to think about the creative uses of biology. That's a kind of contextual part of the answer. More specifically, one thing I really always like to think about with my background and expertise is not so much trying to create some image that we're doing something like that no one's ever thought about before, right? To your point, we have, as human beings, engaged with biology, modified biology, used biology in so many different ways throughout its history, or throughout our human history. We are biology ourselves. But then to think about, as we advance technology curves, what are corollaries to what has happened in other industries? So if you think about the 20th century, I always look at this as a touchstone for what we're doing now. And you look at really the story of economic output in the 20th century, the story of chemistry going from a bench science into an engineerable discipline, and the story of physics going from a theoretical science or a bench science into an engineerable discipline, i.e. something that we use to our own purposes. Chemistry took the barrel of oil and turned it into everything around us, for better or worse. Physics, we now have satellites circulating the globe to allow modern communications and other types of interconnectivity. Airplanes allow us in non-COVID times to go and fly to different places for vacation or for business. Those are all applications of physics, plus if you bring those two together at the end of the century, material science and electrical engineering, you build the microchip and you give yourself the digital technology revolution, which has been this massive added component for the information economy. So being a pretty simple-minded history major, I look at that and say, well, I've taken two of those in high school, chemistry and physics, and then I also had to take biology at the high school level. And it's the only one left of your high school education that we haven't turned into an engineerable discipline. Now, we've done amazing things for all of human history experimenting with biology. That is your kind of your lead in, right? It's not that we aren't aware as humanity of the power of biology. It's been what has allowed us to get to this point already. Now, what we haven't really done is then take and say, what if we could program biology in an engineerable way, in a highly probable, if not at some point predictable way. And what is like the intuition on that has changed? You have convergence of compute, you have convergence of robotics, and then you have an increasing level of knowledge around biological systems. And so what we're doing at GINKGO and others are doing, and this is how I think about the transition to a synthetic biology-led economy, is imagining that the cell is a manufacturing platform. All cells make things, right? And your audience is obviously sophisticated on this topic, so I don't mean to break it down to such a basic level, but like cells are manufacturing platforms of proteins, of chemicals, of themselves replicating, and they run on in our minds and how we think about this and imagine this. They run on digital code in the form of DNA.
Yeah,
And
they're just machines. I mean, really,
they're just machines. And look, they're hyper complicated machines. I don't mean to do it, not do it justice for how complicated this is, but just to get it in folks' heads. That's the big transition that's going on, and what companies like GINKGO and others are working on is how do you make the process of writing de novo programs, new sequences of DNA, not modifying pieces of it, right? More bench sciencey type work, but like truly trying many different full de novo sequences of DNA like programs in these little machines to identify new things that you can make out of biology. And when we get to that and we're aggressively moving down that path, you just have to imagine the economic output that happened in the 20th century by doing that with physics and chemistry to be something that we really have to imagine the art of the possible of how the economy, how society, and how the world will change when we unleash that power in biology. Now, it raises a set of questions, which I know we'll get into, something we care deeply about, and I should just say right up front, is something that is an incredible responsibility. It's incredibly powerful to think about programming cells to make amazing products, not just in drugs, for example, but in every industry that you can imagine. And we have to be really thoughtful and careful about that because biology is part of us. It is every one of us. And we need to make sure that we're doing that in a responsible way. But that's, you asked me the history question. That's how I like put it in my own, like this very big and hard topic, how I put it in a framework for myself, at least to understand it.
I'm sure we share the same predicament. People come to me, what is synthetic.com? What is SynBio? And I just tell them sometimes, I just say, you're not gonna believe what's coming out of this industry in the next 18 to 24 months. It's not like old school biotech. This is happening right now. Biology is transitioning to a software and data business, which means a lot of the investing is done through the P&L, not through the balance sheet. Now that's more like a cloud computing company, right? But this is the way innovative companies gain increasing returns to scale. And can you talk about the way GINKGO acquires customers and produces long-term value?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the question. I mean, this is core to the business model that GINKGO has pursued, is this idea that as you bring this convergence of technologies together, you can change the business model of biotech or synthetic biology. So how we think about this, and it's really been a focus on a piece of a big and important piece of the ecosystem. And that piece of the ecosystem that has been inefficient for decades of biological engineering is the process of which you write a DNA program, synthesize DNA, and place it into a cell. To a first order approximation, I'm giving you an example, right? Place that into a cell, grow and characterize what that cell does with that program, and then learn from the data you get from the other side and cycle that back in and try again. Very much like you might imagine programming a computer with a compiler and debugger. What you do is you essentially write human readable code in Java or another language. You compile that into zeros and ones, and then you debug it to see if it works. If it doesn't work, you try again. Now, in the digital economy, that's essentially free because zeros and ones are very inexpensive. In biology, you're actually physically building things. So what GINKGO is focused on for 13 years, and then if you add the founders' time together getting their PhDs, is asking how can you make the process of programming cells more efficient so that you can write more programs, so that you can experiment more and ultimately get some better outcomes from your program cells. And the base model there, the first piece of what we've been doing, is essentially for a long period of time taking the lab protocols of a bench scientist, moving liquids around, putting them, combining different components of the process, breaking those into unit operations, wrapping them with software and automating them in robotics. So the more you are able to do that, there's a physical scale component. So we're increasing our ability to program more and more cells across multiple industries. So that's when we think about it, we have a horizontal platform instead of historically to build products in biotech, you would build vertically. You would do everything from the basic research all the way to commercialization. So our focus has been to make that cell programming piece, the very complicated part of writing programs into cells, characterizing those, learning from them, and then doing that over and over again, much more efficient. So then it required a business model innovation over the last decade to say, now we want to be partners with the ecosystem, very much like you might imagine. And again, these analogies are good for explaining it, but then obviously, we're building a new industry here. We're a horizontal platform, much like you might think about Amazon Cloud Services being the back end of lots of apps being developed. They do the storage solutions and then a lot of processing capabilities that has become more efficient by leveraging the cloud. 25 years ago, everybody would be buying their own servers. Today, many companies still buy their own cell programming capabilities and do it by hand. What we're trying to do is help people become more efficient with that cell programming piece, and then partner for app development, like the App Store. So those two business models are like what you might want to hold in your head. GINKGO is a horizontal platform for cell programming, partnering with application designers to think about all of the different amazing products that can be built. And we can go into some examples of those. But our goal is to empower companies that want to use synthetic biology, want to use cell programming as an input into their systems. And then our business model is to take, essentially think about how many programs we are running on top of that platform. So instead of one or two, we want to run many, many, many programs on top of the platform, because that means we're touching many industries. We take foundry revenue to pay for that work, but then we take a very small piece of each of those programs and ultimately empower this ecosystem to be built by biology.
It sounds to me like you want to create micro industrial revolutions across the whole economy. Does that capture it?
Look, I think that's an apt way to think about. You can be a little bit kind of get even more direct with it. Planet Earth is essentially made out of biology. Supply chains exist for every industry. Most supply chains somewhere have biology or biologically derived products in them. Very few today have synthetic biology or engineered biology in those supply chains. So we do see this ability over time to impact lots of different industries, micro-industrial revolutions, if you want to go there. The other way to think about it is the digital ecosystem disrupted the information economy, but largely left the physical goods industries untouched. Physical goods industry is the vast majority of GDP in many respects. The back office of those industries might have become more efficient via computing and Zoom, where you can work from anywhere, but the actual industry, the actual physical goods, which is making things, has not been disrupted. And that's what you empower yourself to do as you engineer biology.
So when I was looking into GINKGO's business, I came across a quote from Patrick Boyle. He's an employee. I don't know if you know him, but I love this statement. I'm going to read it to you. Synthetic biology is the only engineering discipline where the engineers are made of the same substrate that they are engineering. So this statement to me is very exciting, but also a little bit scary. How do you think about risk management? It's, I mean, no one's ever done this, like on a platform at a scale that GINKGO's doing it on.
Yeah, so first of all, so Patrick, for those listening, Patrick is our head of code base. So if you think about what we were just speaking about, Ginkgo is a horizontal platform to program cells. There's a physical component to that, but obviously there's a big learning component to that. We learn what programs, what DNA sequences do different things within different types of cells or within different types of applications. Code base is what we think about as the capturing and characterization of all that really interesting genetic information that we are learning about over time. And so Patrick is a very early employee of Ginkgo, and he runs the code base strategy and team, thinking about how do we provide that really interesting knowledge about what DNA programs do to the world. So there's no better person to think about risk management in this context than Patrick and his team. And then more broadly, Ginkgo's full of people who are kind of deeply care about science and biology. And this is like your question is a deeply, has a deep strain of culture throughout Ginkgo of making sure that we are constantly openly with each other and with the public asking these questions and being very transparent about what we're doing. So the first piece of this answer is it's about transparency. It's about making sure that we are building a team that looks at this from multiple different perspectives and is able to pressure us when we pressure us together on the hard questions, because your question is entirely right. Like, this is different. This is biology. This is all of us. And so we look at it and say, first of all, it's too important a technology not to invest in building, right? So our food, health, the environment, so much depends on biology, and there's so much potential in our ability to engineer it. We have to do it. And so, of course, if we're going to do it, there is a risk of doing it. There's a risk in naturally emerging things if we didn't do it. There's a risk in people doing it in ways that don't share what we would consider as open and transparent values. So we should be at the forefront of doing it because it's that important. But if you're going to do that, build a culture of openness, of transparency, of constant questioning. That's risk management 101 for synthetic biology. And then more kind of technical, right? We want to be able to go into a world where, like, we have tanks that are growing food proteins that can switch to vaccine production, right? Like, that's infrastructure for biosecurity. If the bioeconomy is strong, we have the capabilities to respond. We want to have huge sequencing capacity, DNA sequencing capacity, because we're constantly reading new programs that we are writing into cells for consumer applications, but then we can repurpose that to look for pathogens. On a micro scale, the response to COVID, Ginkgo's response and others, exists, our ability to make vaccines faster than we have ever done in human history, our ability to launch large-scale asymptomatic testing to allow information to be presented to communities to make better decisions about spread, like we're doing with K-12 programs across the country. That capability to respond exists because we've started to build an incredibly robust bioeconomy that has capabilities that can be repurposed. Moderna exists to be repurposed to a pandemic. Kalamazoo, Michigan, the Pfizer plant making mRNA vaccines, exists because of a strong bioeconomy, can be repurposed to supply the globe. Ginkgo's platform can be repurposed to be very flexible in helping support vaccine supply chains and doing K through 12 testing. So what you want, because the world, you can't retreat from a world of engineered biology. What you want is a robust, transparent bioeconomy that is ready to go to both build amazing new products so that we can feed the planet, but also be ready to respond as new pathogens emerge, natural or human-made, as we face different challenges from biology as the human population continues to grow. Long answer, but it's something that we care so deeply about, like, it deserves a long answer.
Well, when I hear the word biosecurity, I quickly default to sovereignty. It's really about our nation's sovereignty. So Ginkgo is in Cambridge and Boston. That's the leading biotech hub in the country. Can you share what institutions and labs and government agencies make up the network that is really taking on the sovereignty dimension of this. I mean, it's really the private sector.
Yep. So sovereignty is a really interesting word, and it's a really important word, and it's an even more important word in biology. And so our first premise on this would be that because we're all humans and we're all made of the same substrates, like it actually, what we need to be thinking about when we think about biosecurity is not a nation state or sovereign based system. We really need to be thinking about global solutions, global monitoring of pathogens, global response capabilities, the ability to, we don't get out of COVID-19 until the world gets out of it, right? And so that on first premise, that then hits reality very quickly, obviously. We live in a world governed by sovereign nations that have different governing structures and different priorities and values. So those two things do need to be true together, and we have to think about them together. Second, maybe a little bit more fun, because I really appreciate Boston and being based in Massachusetts. And I say that as somebody who grew up in Maine, who is not allowed usually to express appreciation for Massachusetts. But if you think about it, it's a mental shift that you've got to get your head around. The country of New Zealand, headline maker in their response to COVID, some really amazing approaches, some interesting approaches, 4.9 million people. Switzerland is just over, I believe, 8 million. Massachusetts is about 7 million. And so we often think about these ecosystems in ways, oh, Boston's a small city in America. America's 330 million people, but really it's the ecosystem around Boston is the same size as many nation states, Israel, for example. But you see the headline in The Economist, it talks about nation states because that's the way we organize ourselves. But this ecosystem in Boston is essentially the scale of a nation state, and think about what it's delivered to the world, to the country and to the world. And it's a really important thing to continue to foster. Also, that's a little bit of local pride, but these are companies and ecosystems that are built with global talent. And so this ability to attract and interact both physically and virtually globally is like a very powerful, like human power of humanity. Now, to your very specific question, we think about like the Boston ecosystem. You gotta think about private sector companies obviously driving this response. And we do think biosecurity going forward almost has to be a private industry led biosecurity function. The correlators are things like cybersecurity. The governments of the world don't invent the cybersecurity tools. Why? Because cybersecurity exists to ensure the digital economy is successful. If you didn't have cybersecurity, there would be no digital economy because people wouldn't trust the solutions. Tom Bostic, former head of the US Army Corps of Engineers, one of our advisors, is a great example of the ATM machines. And ATM machines wouldn't be trusted without security. If you didn't believe you could put your money in and see it show up in your bank account, nobody would use them. So for us, we believe like actually the innovation in biosecurity, despite historically it being very tied to like people thinking about it as a government thing, is actually private sector led. And so you see companies like GINKGO, obviously, Moderna, Cambridge-based company, but things that people don't see as often. Lonza, big manufacturing partner of Moderna, is based in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, essentially the Boston ecosystem. NEB, New England Biolabs, a very important supply chain company for the biotechnology and synthetic biology industry, is based in Massachusetts. And then you've got an amazing ecosystem of small companies that are spun out of the second category, universities. Like BioBot is a really cool company doing wastewater monitoring nationally. They have a big partnership with Health and Human Services. Little incubators and seed VCs, Petri Bio, The Engine, really helping create this ecosystem. And why that's important, it's different now. They can now leverage companies like GINKGO to do much more efficient cell engineering so they can focus on these applications. We have a partnership with BioBot as an example to help them do sequencing of wastewater. But then you have obviously the university ecosystems that feed into this industry, MIT and Harvard, but also really important transitions, right? Like now you have places like Northeastern University really has built an amazing international footprint. They're running a massive scale COVID testing lab and have a big regulatory advisory program for international governments around what is biotech regulation, what does it need to look like. They've launched an institute called the Rue Institute in Portland, Maine, to build biotech talent in these kind of satellite cities to the big ecosystems. So I think you're seeing, back to your like core question, in biology, it is a pervasive global thing that needs ecosystems of innovation to build technologies to then be borderless in their application to a first order approximation, because biology doesn't respect borders, and that's a key principle that we have to think about. Other technologies do more so. Biology does not respect borders, as we've seen over the last 18 months.
So when I was right after the wall came down, I was a young banker and I was working in the former Soviet Union. And some of the project I worked on involved putting defense dollars to work from non-Lugar defense conversion financing. And the whole idea was that the collapse of the Soviet Union released, a big pool of talent who had spent their whole lives developing biological weapons and nukes and all kind of nasty stuff. And the purpose of the money was to create private sector opportunities for them, so they just didn't go freelance around the world. But, that was a two-dimensional problem. Today, it's three-dimensional with SynBio. And the money that the government, the intentions were very good, but they just, the government can't do as well as the private sector can do, like what you're doing in this ecosystem in Cambridge. So I'm dying to know, is GINKGO involved or looking at DARPA projects? And by the way, for listeners, DARPA is the Skunk Works project inside the military that's been around a long time and developed a lot of technologies you might have heard of, like the internet.
Yeah, it's so the short answer is yes, and I'll come back to that. I do want to hit on kind of some of the key points that you're raising around, really, if you summarize it, like as we emerge into a world of engineered biology, and as we build tools, and really when I say we, I'm talking about the industry that is, accelerating exponentially in its capacity to do amazing things with programmed biology. There is no question that there are risks to doing that. And I think one of the things that resonates with me, and why myself personally, our team focused on biosecurity at GINKGO and then GINKGO broadly is deeply, deeply committed to this mission, is because you do realize that bad actors in the world, we have a planet that is statistically, there are going to be people that seek to do others harm. And those people have done others harm. And to be blunt about it, the best way I've heard this characterized is that they have not reached the limit of their aspiration to do harm. They have reached the limit of their technology. As horrific as something like the Las Vegas shooting a couple of years ago was, and it was horrific, that person probably did not reach their level of aspiration to kill other people, but they ran out of the tools to do so. A rifle, an assault rifle that they did have access to, could only do so much damage. The scary part, natural or human-made, is that we have just witnessed the incredible amount of economic and human damage biology can do. That is something that we have to acknowledge. And the reality is, whether, as we talked about earlier, we can't stop this progression. The reality is the technology and know-how to program biology and to use biology in creative ways is becoming more diffuse. It is becoming more available to individuals. It is no longer just nation states that can run an amazing engineered biology program. And so when you put those two things together, you actually come to a point where we have an obligation. One of our core advisors is a guy named Andy Weber. He was an assistant secretary of defense in the Obama administration. And he has this kind of concept of, we have the technology and know-how today to make it so that we can essentially make pandemics extinct, natural or human made. It's about defense. So I was a Marine Corps officer. You always think about the balance of the offense in military operations and defense. Well, in biotechnology, the thing that has to be true is that we have to build amazing defensive capabilities. And that's the world of biosecurity tools. And the private sector on the cutting edge of innovation needs to be leading that, because we're the ones that know the best about what can be done, but we can't do that without the market, there being a market to do it. And the governments of the world play a critical role in funding that. And that's where these two things come together. And to give you context, why I give you all that background is because we see the governments playing this critical role, DARPA and IARPA and BARDA, and frankly, the other R&D elements of the DoD in the US, but then internationally, in funding this innovation to build these amazing defensive capabilities like large scale testing and incredible new biosensors and global monitoring networks and rapid response antibody technologies and mRNA technologies, which came from DARPA in the first place. Right. And so that is where the government needs to play an increasing role. And to be blunt, I don't think we invest enough in it today. $16 trillion of economic damage is one estimate of what COVID cost. How many years will it take us to make up that GDP? How much would you have spent to prevent that from happening? And to a first order approximation, we spend a de minimis amount compared to that level of threat. Come back to that in a second. DARPA is a leader in doing this. We do a bunch of work with DARPA. We're really much of GINKGO's capability today, since we've been at it for 13 years and been really efficient, started with programs from DARPA, funding early research into how to build this horizontal platform. We've worked with ARPA-E, the Department of Energy. And then today we actually do have a few programs continuing that we've announced publicly. We have a program called the Revector program, where we're working on developing like novel mosquito repellent by engineering the human microbiome on the surface of your skin, so you don't need chemicals, right? We have another program called the PPB program, working on chem and bio defense to reduce like the burden to people wearing protective equipment, right? Using biology to be a more reactive defense mechanism. And then DARPA is really great because they actually very much engage the private sector in defining what is, they're looking at the horizon. What is the art of the possible? So we're in active conversations with DARPA about that. We also work on a program with IARPA, which is the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency, using that code base that you talked about, Patrick Boyle, our head of code base. We use that code base to build computational algorithms to be able to run different sequences of pathogens or others through that to kind of give a risk-weighted score of whether something might have been engineered by a human or whether it's natural. Because by building a really big database of engineered sequences, we have a better sense of what might be engineered versus not perfect, but an interesting way to think about protecting or doing attribution in the future of where things came from. So that's a set of things that we're doing with the government. We do think that the government should be ramping up investment. We spend tens of billions of dollars a year flying satellites around the world to watch for missile launches, right? Like we spend, I think something, some de minimis sub $100 million a year historically on things like flu surveillance, things that could actually cause economic damage on the $16 trillion level. We're spending very little on. Smartly, but because we know that monitoring for threats like missiles is important, we spend a lot of money on it. We should rebalance those things so the biology is kind of an equivalent investment from a protection and defense standpoint.
Well, when I think of sovereignty, I also, think about who else is on the stage, and China is probably #2 in the world in biotech. In some aspects, China may be on par with the US in AI, machine learning. I mean, their massive data set allows them to do a lot of things that we don't do because we care about privacy. China has accelerated its biosafety and biosecurity legislation quite a bit. I've been monitoring it for 2 years, long before COVID. So there's no doubt that this is in response to the country's building up of assets and biodevelopment programs. They're active in public markets. And there's some rather large biotech companies, Chinese biotechs, that trade in the US. Where is China in terms of your thoughts about risks and threats? And hey, they're also an opportunity, right? We're all human here, but it's shaping up to be a little bit grayer than white, I think.
Well, this is certainly, and I don't think I'm understating this when I say this is probably one of the biggest topics, biggest combined topics, I would argue, of the next 50 years. It's the continued evolution of the global economy and the two main players, China and the United States, how we and they interact with each other. And then that being done in the context of what we started with, which is my strong belief that the bioeconomy will be the largest economic driver of the century. And so this is a big topic. we should do another 3 to 7 hours on this topic. I could
Understood.
We could have really no, but I'm definitely want to get into it. But like, I deeply appreciate the work that you've done on this topic, and having spent a bunch of time reading everything that you've worked on. It's not solved, right? So point number one, the United States has an incredible infrastructure in biotechnology, no question. Number two, China has been investing massively in building their capacity to be innovators in biotechnology, as you point out, right? Like, just to say that up front, I think it's the last 3 5-year plans, the last 3 5-year economic plans from trying to prioritize biotechnology as an area of development broadly. And that's everything from massive scale sequencing, obviously, to interesting international biosecurity tools that they've been leveraging, which we can get into, but just also just the ecosystem of bringing talent back to China, making sure that there's a homegrown industry here. There's no question that is being built. And that's, honestly, in the grand scheme of humanity moving technology forward, that's a great thing. That does not mean that there aren't things we want to be thoughtful about in that context. Kind of here's how I think about it. In the next 5, 10, 30, 50 years, the biggest companies in the world will be biotechnology companies. Probably
I totally agree. By the end of this century, the end of this decade, there are going to be 1, maybe 2 synbio companies in the top 10 market cap companies in the world.
I believe that. And if that is true, that means if you just look at history, the sovereign nations, the nation states, or the economic systems where those companies live, where those companies are taxed, will have a disproportionate role in setting the rules, in regulating and deciding how biotechnology, this thing that we've already spoken about, is like intrinsically us, is used and deployed. So I think those are the stakes, right? And what I would say is, it is not digital platforms. There's not even an argument whether we will have to make values judgments about the application of this technology, or have conversations about the ethics of using this technology in certain ways. That is intrinsic to the technology. So if the biggest companies in the world are going to be synthetic biology companies, the regulatory regimes in which they exist will have both the economic levers and the regulatory levers. And there's going to be, and continues already to be, a values and ethics conversation around this. I think that is where we want to be very thoughtful about how we set the context for transparent and open rulemaking, respect for where biology and biotechnology comes from, ensuring that this is an economy that is developed inclusively, because fundamentally that is how we drive a larger and more peaceful global economy, right? And so those are the macro stakes, and that's going to largely play out between the United States and China to a first order approximation where those technologies are and those companies are being built. So, you know, maybe I'll pause there on that specific piece of it. You know, US companies are amazing. We do, like, the US does need to think about that and look at the competitive dynamic and invest aggressively in making sure that we continue to have a leading industrial base across the whole component of the ecosystem. In my mind, we should be talking about synthetic biology with the same intensity we talk about artificial intelligence, with the same intensity that we talk about quantum computing. It is one of the top, it is the top, but it is certainly in the top 3 critical technologies going forward. And we need to make sure that ecosystem at least has a robust foundation in the United States going forward.
Well, just to wrap up, I'd say it's one thing to be able to talk about it and debate it. It's another thing to have a lab that can do something about it. And it sounds like that's defines what GINKGO is emerging to, what it's becoming or already has become.
Yeah, this is a great, I appreciate you ending on that. You know, GINKGO, as we've spoken about, our mission is to bring this horizontal platform to the world to enable this amazing ecosystem of apps in the bioeconomy. Since the beginning of GINKGO, biosecurity and the ability to do that responsibly has been a core tenet of what we do. COVID has given us the opportunity. Back in March of 2020, we pivoted a massive amount of our platform capacity, which again is agnostic to application, to asking how can we help solve the biggest problems of COVID, which is a global pandemic, which is a biological threat. And so what we were able to do is we committed $25 million in platform capacity earlier in the year. We worked on vaccines, and we've been doing large scale testing across the country. And this is not something that stops at the end of COVID for us. We've now built a scaled, and this is the big change that has happened, right? We now have been able to deploy scaled biosecurity tools across the country. How did we do it? Sort of vaccine supply chain. We've announced a big collaboration with Aldevron, which is a North Dakota company making inputs for the RNA vaccines, the mRNA vaccines. Obviously, we worked with Moderna, but on the testing side, we actually looked and said, because we've had this incredibly distributed response to COVID testing, this unique network of labs has been built state by state, high complexity, CLIA compatible labs. What if we use our capacity at GINKGO to qualify all these labs on things like pooled testing, to do group testing of large cohorts? It is now a distributed infrastructure around the country that is there as like the fiber or the rails of a capability that the next time a pandemic comes, or even right now, we're spending most of our time spinning up K through 12 testing programs for the states of California, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, New Hampshire, Maine, Missouri. That becomes this infrastructure when the next thing happens to be able to detect quickly what's going on and respond to it. So what's changed now is that we're able to take this very generalizable platform, we have access to it, and then apply it in all these different dimensions. One major one that we've made a core of what we do is biosecurity. But when we think about biosecurity, it's all these tools that need to exist to build a holistic response function. So borderless worlds can make sure that the next time that there's a pandemic potential threat, or frankly, intra-pandemic, we're able to have the tools to respond in a way that we didn't have the tools to respond back in January, February, March, April of 2020.
Well, Matt, it's all very exciting, and I look forward to watching GINKGO unfold and meet the challenges that we all know we're going to face soon, and the opportunities.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Simon.